The hum of the engines was a gentle lullaby. Flight 227 cruised at 35,000 feet, a silver dart against a brilliant blue canvas. Below, the world was a patchwork quilt of green fields and winding rivers. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was peaceful. A flight attendant pushed a cart down the aisle, her smile practiced and reassuring. She offered drinks and snacks to the rows of passengers. Some were reading books, their faces illuminated by the small overhead lights. Others watched movies on the seatback screens, lost in worlds of fiction. A man in seat 14A stared out the window. He watched the massive wing slice through the thin, cold air. It seemed impossibly strong, a marvel of engineering. The woman next to him was knitting a small blue baby booty, her needles clicking together in a steady, rhythmic pattern. The pilots in the cockpit went through their routine checks. Captain Eva Rostova was a veteran with over 20 years of experience.
Altitude stable, Ben said, his eyes scanning the array of glowing instruments. Weather is clear all the way to the coast, Eva replied.
But deep within the structure of the aircraft, something was wrong. A tiny hairline fracture in a critical part of the tail assembly was growing. It had started years ago, a microscopic flaw in the metal. With each flight, with every change in pressure and temperature, it had slowly, silently expanded. It was an invisible enemy, a ticking clock that no one knew was counting down. The plane flew on, oblivious to the weakness spreading through its own skeleton. The calm was a fragile illusion, a thin veneer stretched over a disaster that was about to unfold. The stage was set for a tragedy that would change dozens of lives forever. The first sign of trouble was a loud bang. It was not a pop or a crack, but a deep resonant boom that vibrated through the entire fuselage. It sounded like a bomb had gone off in the cargo hold. Every head in the cabin snapped up. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The movie screens flickered and went dark. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the continued hum of the engines, which now seemed menacing instead of reassuring. A baby began to cry, its wail cutting through the silence. Then the plane lurched violently to the right. Not a gentle dip, but a savage, gut-wrenching twist that threw people against their armrests. Drinks flew, food trays flew, splattering the walls and windows. The flight attendants in the aisles were thrown to the floor. One of them cried out in pain. The initial bang was followed by a horrifying grinding noise. It was the sound of metal tearing, of a machine being ripped apart. The plane shuddered from nose to tail. Overhead, compartments burst open, raining down luggage and personal belongings. The symphony of screams began, a few sharp cries of shock and surprise. The plane plunged into a steep, uncontrolled dive, and cries became a chorus of pure terror. People screamed for their loved ones, for God, for anyone. The cabin was utter chaos. Lights flickered on, flickered off, casting the frantic scene in strobing, nightmarish flashes. The grinding became a deafening roar. Outside, the world was a spinning, blurry nightmare. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swinging wildly on their yellow tubes. It was a surreal sight, a safety detail made terrifyingly real. A flight attendant, pale-faced, got on the intercom. "Brace! Brace! Brace! Put your heads down! Stay down! Her training took over. She tried to save them." Some fumbled with masks, their hands shaking too much to secure them properly. Others stared ahead, paralyzed by fear. A man began to pray out loud, a desperate chant against the noise and the collective scream. The dive felt endless. As Flight 227 fell from the sky, the force of gravity pressed everyone deep into their seats. It was a crushing weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The world outside was a dizzying blur of blue and green, spinning faster and faster. The pilots in the cockpit were fighting a losing battle. Captain Rostova, co-pilot Carter. They wrestled with the controls, muscles straining. The control column was useless. It moved freely in their hands, completely disconnected from the tail and rudder. The plane was not responding.
"No control! We have no control!"
They were no longer pilots, they were passengers in a multi-ton projectile aimed at the Earth. Inside the cabin, time seemed to slow down and stretch out. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like an eternity. A young woman thought of the son she would never see graduate. A businessman clutched a picture of his family, his knuckles white. He whispered their names over and over, a final, desperate prayer. Some people held hands with the strangers next to them, finding a small, fleeting comfort. They were all facing the same fate together. The flight attendants moved through the chaotic cabin as best they could. They were injured and terrified, but their training compelled them to act.
"Heads down, grab your ankles."
The ground rushed up to meet them with terrifying speed, the patchwork quilt of fields and rivers. The plane was so low they could see cars on a distant highway. The grinding noise had stopped, replaced by the deafening roar of the wind. The aircraft screamed through the lower atmosphere, a wounded beast making its final desperate plunge. The final seconds were a blur of green and brown. A forest of tall pine trees loomed directly ahead. This was it, the end of the fall. There was a collective gasp in the cabin, a final intake of breath before the world exploded into a nightmare of splintering metal and shattering glass. The command to brace for impact was a turning point. It was an admission that the fall could not be stopped. It was a signal that survival was now a matter of physics and luck. For those who could hear it over the roar and their own pounding hearts, it was a call to action. People who had been frozen in fear were shocked into movement. They followed the shouted instructions, tucking their bodies into the brace position. They bent forward, pressing their chests against their thighs. They put their heads down as low as they could go and wrapped their arms around their legs or the seat in front of them. It was an awkward, uncomfortable position, designed to make the body compact and protected against the violent forces of a crash. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some were too paralyzed by fear to move, sitting upright, eyes wide, staring ahead. Others fumbled with their phones trying to send one last message. A few screamed uncontrollably, terror overwhelming them. But many found a strange, cold calm in those final moments. The decision to brace was a final, active choice. It was the last thing they could do to try to save themselves. Doing something, anything, helped focus the mind and push back the overwhelming panic. It was a small act of defiance against an unstoppable fate. The crew's training was critical in these moments. Flight attendants, despite their own fear, became pillars of strength. Their repeated, forceful commands cut through the chaos. They demonstrated the brace position, movements sharp and precise. They made eye contact with passengers, their gazes communicating urgency and a sliver of hope. As the trees filled the windows, the cabin became a tableau of human response to crisis. A man in an aisle seat reached across and pulled the head of the woman next to him down, forcing her into a brace position just seconds before impact. A mother shielded her child with her own body, a final, selfless act of love. The difference between those who braced and those who did not would become a tragic line between life and death. The position was not a guarantee, but it dramatically increased the odds. The people of Flight 227 were about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. In the weeks following the crash, investigators combed through the wreckage. They meticulously recovered every piece of the shattered aircraft from the forest floor. The black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder were found relatively intact. They held the key to understanding what had happened. The voice recorder captured the pilots' confusion and their desperate, futile struggle to control the plane. The data recorder provided a second-by-second account of the aircraft's final, fatal dive. It showed a catastrophic failure in the tail section. The rudder, the elevators, the surfaces that control the plane's direction and pitch had suddenly stopped responding to the pilot's commands. The plane had become an unguided missile. The investigation soon focused on a single crucial component, the jack screw. This is a long, threaded rod that moves the horizontal stabilizer, a small wing on the tail that controls the plane's nose-up or nose-down pitch. By examining the recovered jack screw under powerful microscopes, investigators found the shocking truth. They discovered a tiny, almost invisible fatigue crack. This crack had likely been present for years, a hidden defect in the metal. Every flight, with its cycles of pressurization and temperature changes, had caused the crack to grow fraction by millimeter, spreading like a disease through the heart of the metal. The maintenance checks had missed it. It was a silent, creeping failure waiting for the right moment to strike. On that fateful day during the smooth, high-altitude cruise, the crack finally reached a critical point. The metal around it could no longer handle the immense aerodynamic forces. With a sudden explosive bang, the jack screw assembly failed. The threads were stripped, and the horizontal stabilizer was torn free from the pilot's control. It was as if the steering wheel of a car had suddenly become disconnected from the front wheels while driving at high speed on a highway. The pilots were left with no way to control the plane's altitude. The aircraft, now fatally unstable, pitched violently downwards into the dive from which it would never recover. It was not pilot error, it was not a storm. It was a simple case of metal fatigue. The revelation was a chilling reminder of the fragility of complex machines. The tragedy of Flight 227 became a hard-learned lesson. one that would hopefully prevent a similar accident from ever happening again. The impact was not an explosion but a deafening, violent symphony of tearing metal. The plane sliced through the tall pine trees which acted like giant shock absorbers. The wings were ripped from the fuselage, the tail section broke away. The main body of the plane skidded across the forest floor for hundreds of yards, shedding parts and debris as it went. It was this violent but progressive breakup that saved lives. Instead of a single catastrophic impact, the energy was dissipated over a longer distance. The section of the fuselage where the survivors were seated remained largely intact, a broken but protective shell. They were the lucky ones. They were in the right part of the plane at the right time. Those who survived the initial impact owed their lives to several key factors. The brace position was number one. It protected their heads and vital organs from the worst of the violent forces. It kept their limbs from flailing around and becoming entangled in the wreckage. Secondly, their seatbelts held them firmly in place, preventing them from being thrown through the cabin like deadly projectiles. Once the motion stopped, a terrifying silence descended, broken only by the crackle of small fires and the groans of the injured. Survival now depended on getting out of the wreckage as quickly as possible. This is where the 90-second rule comes into play. Safety experts say you have about 90 seconds to get out of a plane before a fire can spread and engulf the cabin. The survivors were driven by a primal instinct. Despite their injuries, broken bones, deep cuts, and concussions, they unbuckled their seatbelts and scrambled towards the gaping holes in the fuselage. They ignored the chaos and the carnage around them, focusing only on the light and the fresh air outside. The environment outside the plane presented a new set of challenges. It was a remote, dense forest. The survivors were dazed, injured, and in shock. Some wandered away from the wreckage, disoriented. Others huddled together, sharing warmth and comfort. One survivor, a doctor, immediately began to administer first aid using torn strips of clothing as bandages. This small act of leadership helped to create a sense of order amidst the chaos. They were no longer just passengers. They were a group of survivors, bound together by their shared trauma. For hours, the survivors were alone. They were miles from any road, deep within a forest that had swallowed their plane. The search began as soon as Flight 227 disappeared from radar. Air traffic controllers saw the plane's rapid, unexplained descent. Emergency services were alerted. At dawn, a helicopter pilot spotted a glint on the ground. Sunlight reflected off broken fuselage. He flew closer and saw survivors waving with a signal mirror.
I have them. I have found the wreckage. There are survivors.
The rescue operation swung into high gear. It took the entire day to evacuate everyone. They were flown to nearby hospitals for treatment. They were the survivors of Flight 227, forever marked by the day the sky fell. Their story became a sobering tale of mechanical failure, human error, and the incredible, unpredictable will to survive.